You've probably heard soap kills germs. It doesn't. It grabs them, wraps each one in a slick film, and rinses them down the drain. That trick is 4,800 years old. Babylonians boiled fat with wood ash and got something that finally foamed. At this factory, the same reaction still starts with melted fat and one seriously caustic liquid. Melt two things together and you've got 90% of what makes this bar work. Palm oil gives it hardness. Coconut oil gives it that big, bubbly lather you feel between your hands. Then comes sodium hydroxide, lye, the same substance that strips paint, measured with real precision to build something you'll rub on your face. Some factories reach for rendered beef fat instead, listed on the label as sodium tallowate. It makes a denser, longer-lasting bar, worth knowing next time you're comparing bars at the store. The lye solution goes in thin and clear, almost like water. Nothing about it looks dangerous yet. Pour fat and lye together, and for a moment, nothing looks like soap, just a cloudy, forgettable liquid. Watch closely though, and something strange happens. Fat and lye stop existing as themselves. They become soap, with glycerin forming right alongside it. Chemists call it saponification, but you don't need the word to see it working. This factory runs that reaction non-stop, turning out over 40,000 pounds of raw soap base every day. Within minutes, the liquid thickens into a soft, opaque paste right in front of the mixer blades. You can hear the batch change pitch, a low groan replacing the earlier splash. Soap paste isn't a bar yet. It still has to pass through an amalgamator, which needs in fragrance oil and sometimes glycerin poured right back in. Here's the twist. Many manufacturers pull that glycerin out and sell it separately for lotions since it's valuable on its own. Keep it, and the bar feels noticeably gentler on skin. One reason two bars with the same shape can feel completely different in your hands. From the amalgamator, the paste drops into a plotter, essentially a giant sausage extruder, which squeezes out every trapped pocket of air and pushes the mixture into one long, continuous log. Dense, smooth, no air pockets. A rotary cutter slices that log into bar-sized chunks every second. Tock, 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 like a metronome keeping the whole line on beat. One more transformation and it finally looks like soap. A stamping press slams down with several tons of force, carving the logo and rounding the edges in a single strike. That pressure does double duty. Press too lightly and the bar turns crumbly, dissolving fast the moment it hits water. Here's a question almost nobody asks. Why does liquid soap need preservatives, while many bar soaps barely need them at all? The answer starts right here. A fresh bar comes out of the mold with a surface that bacteria and mold simply don't want to move into. Dry, alkaline, inhospitable. Stamped bars glide onto a curing rack for several weeks. Not decorative, that's chemistry finishing its job. As water slowly evaporates, the bar hardens, turning what would dissolve into mush after 3 showers into something that lasts a full month. A properly cured bar falls within a strict weight range. Too heavy, and it's still holding too much water. Too light, and it dried too fast and turned brittle. A skilled technician can often tell which way a batch has drifted just by the weight in one hand. Cured bars move to a wrapping station, where paper, not plastic, folds around each one and seals with a dab of heat. That paper isn't just tidy branding. It protects the bar during storage and shipping, keeping surface moisture away long before it ever reaches your bathroom shelf. It's also, quietly, one reason a bar of soap needs a fraction of the plastic that a bottle of liquid soap does. Before any bar ships, a moisture sensor checks water content against a strict range. If a bar dried too fast on the rack, it turns brittle and cracks the moment it drops into a shipping case. Any bar outside that range gets pulled and reground into a fresh batch instead of thrown away. Nothing here goes to waste. It just goes back to the beginning. But soap only dissolves grease. It never scrubs anything loose. That job falls to the sponge beside it, and a 2026 study found it may shed more plastic than the grease it removes. A cereal company used to hold the patent on your kitchen sponge. DuPont's engineers invented it in the 1940s, guarded the formula for years, then quietly sold it to General Mills. That sale ended an older ritual. Divers no longer plunge to the ocean floor for sea sponges, each one taking years to regrow. At this factory, sheets of wood pulp begin that transformation instead.
The base ingredient arrives as stiff cellulose sheets, pressed from wood pulp. Nothing spongy yet. A softening bath fixes that fast, turning the fibers jelly-like within minutes. Next, hemp fiber, chosen because it holds a stretch without tearing the way rebar holds concrete. Cotton fiber breaks down faster once it's wet for hours on end, the daily fate of a kitchen sponge. Look for 100% cellulose on the label. It means no shortcut paper filler. Then the strangest ingredient, Glauber salt, once sold in pharmacies as a stomach remedy. It rattles in dry and glassy, no hint of what it's about to become. Here's the part that sounds backwards. This mixture is mostly salt, not sponge. A rotating drum blends the softened cellulose with hemp fiber, dye, and so much Glauber salt that crystals can make up nearly 90% of the total weight. The cellulose is almost a minor ingredient in its own product. That thick, gritty paste pours into a mold the size of a small car, roughly 2 feet wide and 6 feet long. You can hear the mixture slosh and settle, heavy with all that salt. Nothing like the light foam it's about to become. Now the mold goes into a heating chamber, and this is where the trick actually happens. As the temperature climbs, those Glauber salt crystals do something strange. They melt straight into liquid and drain out through tiny openings in the mold's floor, carrying the salt away and leaving nothing but empty space. Every hole in a finished sponge is really the ghost of a crystal that used to be there. 90 minutes in the chamber, and a block that went in heavy and dense comes out light enough to float, riddled top to bottom with the pockets that will someday hold soap and water at your sink. Light, porous, unmistakably a sponge. The block still needs a wash in hot water and a touch of bleach to rinse out any last trace of salt. Once rinsed, the giant block gets sliced by a bank of parallel blades into long sheets, each cut clean in a single pass, ready to become the individual sponges that will end up stacked in a grocery aisle. Here's where two very different materials meet. The cellulose sheets pass under a cutting die, punched into the rectangle you'd recognize instantly at a rate of over 200 a minute. But the rough green layer glued to one side isn't cellulose at all. It's woven nylon or polyester, bonded on with a thin layer of adhesive that sets as the sheets move down the line. Too little glue and the scrub pad peels off within a week. Too much and the whole sponge stiffens into something nobody wants to hold. Technicians check peel strength on samples before every shift begins. That rough layer is also the part that slowly wears down as you scrub, and the part researchers now connect to tiny plastic fibers leaving the sponge. Sponges roll off the line in neat pairs, one soft side, one rough, fused together for good. Finished sponges get shrink-wrapped, 2 or 3 to a pack, the exact bundle you'd grab off a supermarket shelf without thinking twice. The plastic isn't just there to hold the pack together. It seals in moisture so the sponge doesn't dry out and shrink before it reaches your sink. Leave a pack open too long, and you'll notice the sponge feels stiffer before it ever touches water. Every batch gets tested for absorbency before it ships. A sample sponge is weighed dry, soaked, then weighed again. If the pores came out too small or too tightly packed, the sponge won't hold enough water to work properly at the sink, and the whole batch gets flagged. Pass, and it's cleared for the shelf, ready to become the best cleaning tool in your kitchen. But a sponge only cleans if you do the work. The next product handles a different mess entirely. You do nothing, it dissolves in seconds, and your clothes come out cleaner anyway. Detergent pods didn't exist until 2012. Today, they make up a quarter of the entire American laundry detergent market. Before pods, doing laundry meant guessing, eyeballing a cap full of liquid soap, pouring more than any load actually needed. At this factory, 3 separate liquids start the journey toward becoming one single, dissolvable dose. 2 separate worlds arrive here, and neither looks like laundry soap yet. Pellets of plastic engineered to dissolve on contact with water make up one side. 3 liquid concentrates in separate tanks make up the other, kept apart because they cannot stand each other. Enzymes that chew through protein stains break down fast around bleach whiteners, keep them apart, and each stays at full strength until wash day. That is why many pods come in separate chambers, not just for color, but to keep those ingredients apart. The pellets rattle into a hopper, dry and hard, nothing like the film they're about to become. Here's the part that sounds backwards. Before it can wrap around anything, that plastic has to become liquid first. The pellets melt down and get pushed through a die into an impossibly thin sheet, engineered down to roughly 100 microns, about the thickness of a sheet of paper. Thin enough to dissolve in seconds, tough enough to survive being tossed around inside a washing machine drum. The sheet rolls onto giant reels, cooling as it goes. You can hear the low hum of rollers stretching the film taut, stopping just short of tearing it. Now the film meets heat and vacuum at the same time, and this is where flat sheets turn into something with actual shape. The film softens under warm air while a vacuum pulls it down into a mold, stretching it into a grid of tiny cups, hundreds across a single sheet, each one destined to hold a dose of liquid. A nozzle system moves over every cup, dosing out the first liquid, then the second, then the third, never letting them touch until the very last second. Precise, layered, one liquid at a time. A second sheet of film drops on top, and heated rollers press the 2 layers together, sealing each cup shut in a fraction of a second. This one line seals thousands of pods every single minute, enough that by the time you finished reading this sentence, another batch has already rolled off the line. A rotary blade punches around each sealed cup, trimming away the excess film and setting every finished pod free from its neighbors. What started as 2 flat, featureless sheets now looks exactly like the pod sitting in your laundry room. Here's a question most people never think about. Why is the outside of a laundry pod made to taste awful the second it touches a tongue? That bitterness isn't an accident. It's a compound added on purpose, so bitter that people can detect it in tiny parts per billion amounts, among the bitterest substances. A precision doser adds just enough to coat the film without slowing how fast it dissolves. Too much, and the pod breaks down slower in the wash. Too little, and it fails its whole purpose. A lab check verifies the bitter coating is there without changing how fast the film dissolves. It's strange engineering, designing a product to work perfectly and taste absolutely awful at the same time. Finished pods drop onto a conveyor in a steady, colorful stream. Finished pods drop into an opaque plastic tub, not a random choice. Early transparent packaging made the bright, candy-colored pods look like actual candy, so manufacturers switched to solid colors and a lid that needs 2 deliberate motions to open, which makes the package harder for small children to open by accident. The tubs seal shut, keeping moisture out until the very first twist. Every batch gets dunked in cold water and timed. If a pod takes a few seconds longer than spec to dissolve, the film thickness is off and the whole run gets flagged. A second check looks for weak seals, a single pinhole leak, and the liquid inside would start eating through the film in storage. Pass both tests, and the pod is cleared for the shelf. That thin film patiently waiting for its one dissolving moment. But that disappearing film in your washer has something in common with the next product, candle wax. One is built to vanish in water, the other is built to feed a flame for hours. The flame on a candle never touches the wax. It burns vapor, pulled up through the wick like fuel through a straw. Before that, candles burned tallow, animal fat, thick with smoke and a heavy smell. Paraffin arrived in the 1850s from the new world of oil refining, changing candle making almost overnight. At this factory, that same wax starts in a melting tank. 2 ingredients decide almost everything here. The wax is usually paraffin, a petroleum wax that takes color cleanly and carries fragrance well. Soy wax is common too, chosen for a softer look and a slower melt. And the wick, braided cotton, for a steady burn. Older wicks used a metal core to stay upright, often lead, until the US banned lead core wicks in 2003. Today, metal core wicks are usually made with safer alternatives like zinc. Look for wicks labeled 100% cotton to skip metal altogether. Wax pellets pour into the melting tank, dry and opaque, nothing like the glassy liquid they're about to become. Here's the part most people never picture. Solid wax has to become completely liquid before anything else can happen to it. The tank heats past 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and what was opaque and waxy turns clear, almost like water. Dye goes in first, then fragrance oil, added at just the right moment. Too early, and heat burns off the scent before it ever reaches your living room. This factory blends over 200 different scent combinations, each one measured to the gram. The fragrance folds into the hot wax, and the whole room shifts scent in seconds. Now the liquid wax gets poured, and this is where a candle actually becomes a candle. A wick, pre-glued to the base of a glass jar, gets centered by a small mechanical clip that holds it perfectly straight while hot wax floods in around it. Off-center by even a few millimeters, and the candle burns unevenly, tunneling down one side instead of melting the surface flat. This one line fills over 3,000 jars an hour, each dose to the same fraction of an ounce, enough candles in a single shift to fill a small living room floor to ceiling. Clear, golden, and perfectly still. The filled jars glide into a cooling tunnel where the wax sets from the outside in over the next hour. Here's the strange part. As wax cools, it shrinks. And that shrinking pulls the surface down into a small crater around the wick, a flaw invisible until the candle is fully solid. Nothing about this stage looks finished yet. It looks more like a mistake waiting to be fixed, and in a sense, it is. That crater around the wick gets a second pour, a thin top-up layer, heated slightly differently so it bonds seamlessly instead of leaving a visible seam. Get the temperature wrong, and you'd see a faint ring where the two pores meet, like a scar on the surface. A trained technician checks that seam by feel on random samples, running a finger across the top before it's approved to ship. Once smooth, an automated trimmer snips every wick to a 1/4 inch. Too long, and the flame grows tall and smoky. Too short, and it drowns in its own melt pool. This machine trims over 4,000 wicks an hour without one slipping past uncut. The trimmer clips through cotton with a soft, satisfying snap, and a fine dusting of fiber drifts onto the conveyor below. A metal lid seals each jar shut, not just for a finished look, but to lock in fragrance that would otherwise fade within weeks on a shelf. That's the same reason candle shops always smell so strong. The second a lid comes off, scent starts escaping for good. A printed label wraps the glass, and jars are boxed in flats of 6, ready for the exact shelf display you've probably stood in front of, comparing scents. Before any candle ships, a sample from every batch burns under a hood for hours, timed against the label's promised burn time. If it finishes early, the wax blend was off, and the whole batch gets held back. A candle promising 40 hours needs to deliver close to 40, not 25. Technicians also watch flame height and soot the entire time. A flame that grows too tall or smokes too dark fails on the spot, no matter how good it smells. Only candles that burn clean, steady, and on schedule move on to the shelf. Next time you light a candle, remember, the flame is not eating the wax you see. It is burning vapor pulled up through a cotton wick, one invisible sip at a time.